I first saw them at dawn standing along the eastern fence line like they owned the place. There were 5 of them. 3 in reflective vests, 2 in crisp polos with clipboards. Hard hats, tool belts, smug expressions that didn't belong to anyone who had ever worked this land. The air was thick with dust and pride, as one of them kicked at the base of the fence post, as if testing its strength. My boots hadn't even sunk into the dew-covered grass yet, and already my blood was simmering. The tall one with a clipboard waved lazily at me. Morning will be done before you know it. Done with what? I tightened the straps on my overalls and walked closer. Eyes narrowed, heart pounding just behind my ribs. Who the hell are you? He chuckled like it was a joke. HOA property inspection and mineral survey, sir. Just routine. Should have received notice in your mailbox. There had been no notice. I'd checked the mail like I always do, same time. Every morning ever since I retired from the Navy 12 years ago. That box is my ritual, my first checkpoint in a day of small but sacred routines. And it had been empty yesterday. No flyer. No envelope. No warning. This is private land, I said, planting my boots on the inside of the property line. You're not with the city. You're not with the state. You're trespassing. The one with the clipboard raised an eyebrow and scribbled something. Another guy, a younger one, maybe mid-20s, rolled a rented ground-penetrating radar cart toward the edge of my fields. I stepped in front of it. Don't I warned, not one more inch. Sir, with all due respect, the HOA board has approved mineral exploration for community development. You signed the charter. Page 14, subsection 3. They always throw paperwork in your face like it's holy writ. Like some dotted line from 10 years ago gives them a divine right to strip away your soil. I signed a document to pay dues for mailbox repairs and common area mowing, I snapped. Not for strangers to dig up my father's land, looking for gold like we're in some goddamn Clint Eastwood movie. They exchanged glances, clipboard guy, radar boy, and the 2 others by the work truck idling on the curb. One of them pulled out a cell phone and began recording like I was the lunatic here. Like defending what's mine was a crime against decorum. That's when I saw her. Darla Langston, president of the HOA board, stood across the street behind mirrored sunglasses and a ceramic travel mug like she was sipping a latte while Rome burned. Her bleach blonde bob didn't move in the breeze. She didn't wave. She didn't smirk. She just stared at me with that dead expression she saves for board meetings and garbage can complaints. Darla, I yelled, stepping past the radar cart. What the hell is this? She didn't flinch. Just lifted the mug to her lips and sipped. Then finally she said, "It's all legal, Richard. You should have read the fine print." Richard, not Mr. Hale, not sir, not neighbor, just Richard like I was a dog in her yard. I clenched my jaw, my fists, everything. These weren't people. These were parasites dressed like professionals. They didn't care that this land had been in my family since 1948. That my grandfather laid the first cedar fence by hand. That my father died out here pulling weeds between treatments. That the barn with the rusted roof held more history than their entire cul-de-sac put together. They saw acreage. They saw possibility. They saw profit. Leave, I said lower now. Quieter but more dangerous. Before I call the sheriff and file trespassing charges. Clipboard guy sighed like I was the one wasting time. You'll want to take it up with the HOA, sir. We're just following work orders. I stepped toward him close enough that he flinched. Then go follow them somewhere else. He muttered something to the guy with the phone, and just like that, they turned around, packed up the radar cart, slid clipboards under their arms. Darla never moved, never blinked, just watched them pile back into the truck with the same flat expression. As they drove away, she shouted without raising her voice, "You can't stop progress, Richard." I didn't answer. I stood there in the dust of their departure, the quiet rustle of dry grass returning to its place. My hands trembled not with fear, but with something older, something I thought I'd left behind in the service. It wasn't just a violation, it was a message. They'd tested the line to see if I'd defend it. They'd be back. And next time, they wouldn't bring clipboards. They'd bring claws. The silence that followed their departure settled over my fields like an old wool blanket, itchy, suffocating, and heavy with memory. I stood at the edge of the fence line, long after the dust from their tires had faded into the morning haze. My boots sank slightly into the soil soft from last week's light rain, and I felt the familiar give beneath me, like a breath exhaled by the earth itself. This land knew me, and I knew it. I wasn't born on this farm, but I was made by it. Every blister I'd ever earned, every scar on my hands, every stiff joint that ached when the air turned it all traced back to this soil. My father, Hank Hale, used to say the dirt here was sacred, but not soft. It didn't yield unless you earned it, and he earned every inch. He bought this place in 1963, back when you could still buy 20 acres outside the city limits without a mortgage that would choke a man. It had been nothing but brush, brittle fence posts and an old well when he started. But he built it one shed, one post, one fence, one row at a time. By the time I was 10, we had a working farm. 3 horses, 10 goats, 1 ornery rooster, and about a dozen hens that gave eggs sweeter than anything from the store. We weren't rich. Hell, we were barely solvent. But my father never measured wealth in dollars. He measured it in boundaries, what was his and what wasn't. And more than anything, he believed in land, in ownership, in the idea that a man's place in the world was carved from the soil he kept. That belief hardened in him when the developers came in the 90s. I was away in the Navy then, stationed in Norfolk, Virginia. By the time I returned in 2001 after 2 deployments and a medical discharge, the country roads I remembered had become paved ribbons lined with plastic houses and chemically green lawns. A whole new HOA community had been built just west of the property, and the board had annexed the eastern edge of the neighborhood using some paperwork trickery and a sympathetic city planner. That's when Darla Langston arrived, fresh-faced, manicured, and ruthless in ways only a suburban general could be. She climbed the HOA ladder like it was a personal crusade, and within 3 years, she'd orchestrated the vote to fold our area into the association's extended development buffer zone. My father refused to sign the inclusion documents. They retaliated by trying to fine him for weeds. When that didn't work, they tried claiming his outer acreage wasn't properly fenced, despite the property being grandfathered in under old zoning rules. He fought every notice, every complaint, every threat of lien. He won most of them because he kept records, every envelope, every letter, every receipt. But it wore on him. I saw it in his shoulders, in the way he sat longer at the table, in the mornings, sipping coffee in silence, his eyes on the fields. The cancer came in 2009. By then, he had stopped arguing with Darla's board entirely. He spent his last months walking the perimeter each morning, even when he couldn't make it past the barn without resting. He died in the back bedroom, facing the land he spent his life tending. And before he passed, he looked me in the eye and said, "Never let them put claws in this dirt, son. It remembers us." I buried him beneath the oak tree near the back slope, the tree he planted the year I was born. After that, I refused every offer. The HOA had approached me 3 times in 12 years, each time cloaked in different disguises: green space revitalization, community park expansion, low-impact resource exploration. Every time I told them to get the hell off my land. But this time, this crew, it was different. This wasn't just posturing. This was execution. They had permits, they had work orders, they had uniforms, and they had the confidence of people who believed no one would stop them. That night, I poured myself a whiskey and sat out back facing the hills. I pulled out the old lockbox my father left me. Its corners rusted the clasp, worn but still solid. Inside the documents were exactly as I remembered the original deed from 1963, notarized copies of land survey maps, letters from zoning commissions. And beneath all of that, a faded folder marked in his handwriting: "Do not share, not yet." I didn't open it that night. I stared at it for a long time, thumb tracing the loops in his cursive, remembering the weight in his voice when he'd talked about what's buried under here. He never explained it, said it wasn't time. That when it mattered, I'd know. And now it felt like it mattered. The next morning, I drove down to the county recorder's office with my documents in a manila envelope and asked to speak with Land Services. The woman behind the counter, a no-nonsense type named Marla, frowned as she read the HOA work order number I handed her. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she leaned closer. "You didn't sign the mineral rights release?" she asked. "No," I said. "Never even saw it." She tapped a few keys on her computer, then pulled up a scanned document with a digital signature. The name on it, mine. Except it wasn't my signature. It was neat, curved, more like the way I used to sign school permission slips when I was in high school. Not the blocky scrawl I've used since the Navy. "I need a copy of that," I said quietly. Marla slid the paper into the copier without saying a word. Forgery. They had forged my name, and the HOA had either known or didn't care. Back home, I sat at my desk and stared at the fraudulent release. My heartbeat wasn't fast, it was cold. Focused. I picked up the folder marked, "Do not share." And this time, I opened it. Inside were two things: a single-page letter handwritten, and a sealed envelope addressed to me. The letter read, "If they ever dig, make sure they see this first. If they already have, show the world." I opened the envelope. Inside was a deed, but not just any deed. It was a transfer of stewardship signed by my father and notarized before his death, stating that the back 3 acres of the property had been designated as a registered historical protection zone due to what lay buried beneath it. It wasn't minerals. It was something more powerful, something no HOA could bulldoze. But I'd have to let them dig deeper just enough to damn themselves before I revealed the truth. 2 days passed before the crew returned this time, without hard hats or radar equipment. Instead, they brought back a different kind of power clipboard, men in suits, sunglasses, and smug grins. One of them, a wiry guy, with thinning blonde hair and a Bluetooth headset jammed permanently in one ear, introduced himself as Peter Langley, legal counsel for the HOA. I didn't shake his hand. Peter stood just inside my property line like he was staking a claim in wet cement. "Mr. Hale," he said with manufactured warmth, "we're here to clear up any confusion about the Mineral Rights Survey. The HOA board understands there may have been miscommunication." "Is that what you're calling it now?" I asked, holding up the forged release form. "Because this looks more like felony forgery to me." Peter smiled like I'd complimented his tie. "You'll want to be careful with accusations like that, sir. That document was provided in good faith by the board, signed, sealed, and recorded with the city." "Yeah," I said, "but not by me." His smile stayed in place, but the edges frayed slightly. He motioned toward a second man in a gray jacket, who handed me a fresh packet of papers, 30 pages thick, bound at the corner. "This is a revised notice of exploration." Peter continued. "It includes language about potential mineral royalties and your participation in any future development decisions. A goodwill gesture." I didn't open the packet. Instead, I pointed toward the barn. "You see that building?" I said. "My dad built it with his own hands in '65. He put his initials in the concrete foundation. That man died in that house defending this land from people like you. And now you want to dig through it for quartz or lithium or God knows what not happening." Peter let out a little exhale through his nose, the kind that lawyers make when they think they're about to win a case just by waiting. "Mr. Hale, the board, has already signed contracts with an environmental firm and a private contractor. Backing out now could cost the HOA a substantial penalty. There are better ways to resolve this than going to court." "Court," I echoed. "You think I'm scared of court?" He blinked. "Well, if we go that route, it will become a matter of public record. And I imagine you'd rather avoid the legal fees and press attention, especially if the board has reason to believe you're hiding undeclared resources." My jaw tightened. That's when I knew they were bluffing. They had no idea what was really buried on that back lot. They were hoping I'd fold before they had to find out. I said nothing, just turned and walked back to the porch, letting the screen door slam behind me. They stood there for a few minutes longer, probably for show, then left a copy of the goodwill agreement in my mailbox like a dog marking territory. That night, I went back to the rusted lockbox and pulled out the full letter my father had written. I'd only skimmed it before, too stunned by the deed to read the rest, but now I needed to understand. The letter was dated October 2nd, 2009, 3 weeks before he died. And Richard. It began. "I know you love this place as much as I do, maybe even more. You were always the one who stayed longer, worked harder, came back even when you didn't have to. I want you to have everything: the land, the house, the peace it gave me. But you also deserve to know what's underneath it." I paused. "What's underneath it?" He continued. "In 1971, your grandfather unearthed something behind the east slope while clearing for pasture. Human remains, shallow, old. We called the university. Archaeologists came, mapped it, and found it was a tribal burial ground, undisturbed, sacred. The university offered to buy the back 3 acres for research. Your grandfather refused. He said disturbing it again would curse the land. Instead, he registered the plot with the county as a protected site under heritage law, quietly. No press, no signs. We kept it in the family. I lowered the paper slowly, the back slope, where the crew had aimed their radar. They didn't know what they were about to dig into, and if they had, they wouldn't just be trespassers. They'd be grave robbers. I turned the page. On that deed I signed, it doesn't just give you the land, it gives you guardianship. If anyone ever tries to dig you, show them the certification, the registration file, and the archaeological report. I made copies. They're in the folder marked Shield. I opened the second folder, and there it was, a certified copy of the Protected Cultural Site designation maps, with coordinates and a signed report from 1972 by Dr. Glenn Edgers from the University of Texas. The findings were conclusive: at least 14 burial mounds aged between 500 and 900 years old. Caddo tribe, legally untouchable, under both state and federal preservation law. Any attempt to dig there could result in criminal charges, not to mention lawsuits. But the HOA had already stepped into it blind. Now the question wasn't if I'd stop them. It was how I'd make them feel the consequences. I spent the next morning scanning the documents, making multiple certified copies, and preparing a packet for the County Heritage Office, the City Planning Department, and most importantly, the local press. The same small-town paper that had ignored my HOA complaints for years would be very interested in a story about illegal digging on indigenous graves. That afternoon, I made my way to the HOA's monthly board meeting. I didn't ask permission to speak. I walked straight in, right in the middle of Darla Langston's update on land enhancement opportunities. She paused mid-sentence as I placed a manila folder on the table before her. "I'd like to introduce the board," I said calmly, "to the actual owner of the mineral rights you've been digging into." The room fell quiet. I opened the folder, laying out copies of the deed, the registration certificate, and the archaeological report. "Those graves you disturbed, they're protected under federal law. This land isn't just mine. It belongs to history. And now, thanks to your illegal actions, it's going to belong to the courts too." Darla's face drained of color. Her lips parted, but no words came out. "You tried to dig up my farm for profit," I said. "But now the only thing you'll be digging is your own legal grave." And with that, I turned and walked out. I didn't need to stay and hear the gasps. The law was louder than I'd ever be. I expected panic. I expected outrage. Hell, I expected someone on the HOA board to at least fake remorse or guilt when I dropped the truth like a sledgehammer on their polished oak meeting table. But that night, after I left the HOA meeting with my father's legacy echoing in every word I spoke, I received something else entirely. A knock on my door at 7:42 p.m. and a letter slid through my mail slot. I didn't even need to open it to know it was another punch from the same fist. The envelope was thick embossed, with the HOA's seal, a golden acorn, inside a triangle of laurel leaves. Pretentious, cold, meant to intimidate. Inside was a 5-page document marked Official HOA Response to Claims Regarding Unauthorized Digging. Their tone, dismissive, almost smug. In their words, "No evidence has been found to prove the site in question holds valid historical protection under current ordinances." They claim the site had no posted signage, no physical boundary markers, and according to them, the registry from 1972 had likely expired or was voided due to procedural failures. Bullshit. And they knew it. This wasn't about law, it was about pressure. They knew if they stalled me long enough, dragged me through enough red tape, I might give up. Or settle. Or lose track of which form to file, where, and when. It was a game. A sick bureaucratic game they'd played for years against neighbors too tired or too afraid to fight. But I wasn't afraid. And I wasn't tired. I was just getting started. I picked up the landline and called Lisa Moreno, a former Navy paralegal who now worked for the State Heritage Commission. We'd served in the same unit 15 years ago. She was sharp, thorough, and had a long memory, especially for favors owed. She picked up on the third ring. "Rich, haven't heard from you since the VA case. What's going on?" "I've got a registered indigenous burial site on my land," I said, pacing the kitchen. "HOA just dug into it and is pretending it doesn't exist." Lisa didn't miss a beat. "You have documentation. Original registration, state-level designation, university report, all of it." She was quiet for a moment. "Then email it to me tonight." I'll walk it to the state's legal office myself in the morning. The next day, I delivered a cease and desist letter to the HOA office. Not the kind printed off Google. Not the kind you toss in a mailbox and pray someone reads. This one came with weight. It was drafted by Lisa herself, co-signed by the State Office of Historic Preservation, and accompanied by an active enforcement order, warning of criminal liability under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA. 3 felonies. Per violation. I hand-delivered it to the HOA's glass front office on Main Street and slid it across the marble desk to their legal assistant, a pale woman with a headset and pink nails that drummed against her keyboard. She glanced at the state seal and stiffened. I'll give this to Ms. Langston. You do that, I said, and tell her she has 48 hours to pull all work orders and issue a public apology, or the state attorney general gets involved. That afternoon, I returned home and found 2 white pickup trucks parked near the back slope of my property. No logos, no plates on the front. One of the workers had a drilling core extractor. Another held what looked like a sample bag. I pulled my truck across the gravel like thunder and slammed the door hard enough to startle birds from the trees. Off my land I roared, walking straight toward them. One of them dropped the bag. We're just doing soil tests, sir, nothing permanent. Did you not get the memo? I yelled. This land is under federal protection. You're standing on sacred ground. They looked confused. One muttered something about a contract with Langston's board. I held up my phone already recording. You're trespassing, and now it's documented. Get in your trucks and drive before I call the sheriff and the tribe. That last part made their eyes widen. It worked. They left. But not before one of them whispered they said this was cleared, that the homeowner agreed. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. Langston had told them I consented. Another lie. Another layer in a growing web of forged documents and falsified records. This wasn't incompetence anymore. This was criminal. That night, I filed an official report with the sheriff's office. I sent them copies of the cease and desist, the archaeological documents, the video of the trespassers, and the signed letter from my father. Sheriff Calhoun, an old-timer with a ranch of his own, called me personally. I know you rich, he said. I know your father. This smells bad. I'm dispatching someone tomorrow to walk that site and get eyes on it. It was a small win, but I needed something bigger. So I called a journalist. Her name was Brooke Chen. She wrote for the Midland County Record, a modest publication, but the kind that still valued truth. We'd gone to high school together. She was skeptical at first until I showed her everything. The forged signature, the state documents, the photos of the disturbed site. This'll run front page, she said. If the paper doesn't run it, I'll publish it under my name online. By the next morning, the story had spread. The headline read, HOA accused of digging up native graves on private farm. By noon, it had over 3,000 shares. By evening, the local tribe had released a statement of concern. By the end of the day, Darla Langston issued a rebuttal on the HOA's Facebook page, calling my claims unverified and emotionally charged. They still weren't taking me seriously. But that was about to change. Because the next time they touched a shovel, they wouldn't find minerals or history. They'd find the line I had drawn. And they'd learn what happens when they cross it. The morning after the article broke, I woke up to a dozen messages on my phone and tire tracks near my eastern field. Not the kind made by standard HOA maintenance trucks. These were deeper, heavier, with a staggered tread that told me whoever had come brought machinery. I walked out in my boots before the sun had fully lifted and followed the tracks like a hunter on his own land. They led me down to the lower pasture, the part we'd always kept roped off, the part Dad told me never to mow, never to plow, never to touch. Even when the grass got high and the HOA sent me passive-aggressive letters about visual unity, I ignored them. There were small mounds there, about a dozen, shaped like miniature hills no more than 2 feet high. I grew up pretending they were sleeping animals under blankets of soil. Now one of them was gone, leveled. I stood there staring at a shallow pit carved into the side of one of the mounds, the dirt still fresh, glistening as if it had been dug only hours before. Discarded beside it was a broken plastic flag marker, the kind used for utility lines or construction zones. I spotted a small bag of core samples ziplocked, labeled but left behind in haste. They'd been back. And they'd dug into something sacred. I knelt beside the pit hands, trembling not with fear but with fury. I didn't know what I'd find, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been violated. A boundary crossed. A line that couldn't be uncrossed. Then I saw it. Half buried in the corner of the pit, a dark fragment bone. Not modern, not fresh. Weathered, fossilized, the kind of thing you'd see under glass in a museum. I knew it wasn't an animal. My gut screamed it. I didn't touch it. I called Lisa Moreno first, sent her photos, and waited while the phone buzzed with a response that came faster than I expected. "That's enough for a federal case," she said. "Send me GPS coordinates and I'll notify the state archaeological response team. They'll take over from here." By noon, 2 state SUVs and a black tribal preservation vehicle were parked along my gravel road. I met them out back. Introductions were quick, no small talk, no ceremony. These people were professionals, and their faces turned grave the second they saw the disturbed site. The lead archaeologist was a woman named Dr. Shelby Cole. She crouched beside the mound, dusted the soil with gloved fingers, and let out a slow breath. "Cato," she murmured, "you weren't exaggerating. I didn't need validation, but hearing it aloud tightened something in my chest. Grief maybe for what had been desecrated, or pride for defending it." They began photographing, flagging, measuring. A second team started roping off the area with biodegradable cord, gently placing orange markers around each untouched mound. Then came the evidence, technicians bagging, tagging, documenting everything. The soil samples, the tire tracks, even the flag pin. I asked one of the younger techs, what happens next? He didn't look up. If this was unauthorized, and it clearly was someone's about to be in deep trouble. Not just civil, criminal. By late afternoon, the sheriff showed up. Calhoun stepped out of his cruiser slowly, hat in hand, eyes scanning the slope like he was seeing it for the first time. "You tried to warn them," he muttered. "You really did." I nodded. They thought I was bluffing. Calhoun walked over to Dr. Cole, listened quietly for a few minutes, then turned to me. "We'll be filing formal charges. I already spoke with the district attorney's office. They're interested." That night, a second article ran. "Ignored cease and desist, illegally excavated, protected tribal site." This one had pictures, not just of the damage, but of Darla Langston walking with contractors on my land, time-stamped from security footage pulled from a neighbor's camera. The article quoted Dr. Cole Lisa Moreno and a tribal representative named Tomas Red Elk, who called the act a spiritual violation and promised to seek all available avenues of justice. The community exploded. Neighbors who had once stayed silent suddenly found their voices. My inbox was full of support, people offering help, others asking what they could do to make it right. One woman, a soft-spoken widow from 3 streets over, dropped off a pie on my porch with a note that read, "For standing when the rest of us were too tired." But the HOA, they didn't apologize. Instead, they sent a second letter. This one written on even heavier paper stock, like a declaration of war. They disputed the claims again, called the dig, an unfortunate mistake by an unauthorized subcontractor. Claimed they had no knowledge of any historical significance and that the land's registry had not been clearly communicated. They were doubling down, shifting blame. But something had shifted in me too. This wasn't about protecting my farm anymore. This was about honoring my father's final wish, guarding the memory of the people who'd come before us, and making sure the arrogant, power-hungry puppeteers behind the HOA board learned that consequences still existed in this world. So I made a decision. I went back into the house to the study and pulled the last folder from the bottom of the lockbox. The one Dad had labeled Final Card. Inside was a notarized affidavit signed by my grandfather in 1974, along with correspondence from the University of Texas, confirming the land's designation as a Class B Indigenous Burial Protection Zone. But the real treasure was what lay beneath it. A survey map proving the HOA had never legally annexed my land. There it was, clear as daylight. Their entire claim of governance over my property was based on an error from a zoning meeting in 2003 that had never been ratified at the county level. They had no authority here. They never had. For 20 years they'd been bluffing, and now I held the trump card. The next morning, I scheduled a meeting with the county assessor's office. It was time to redraw the line and then rub their noses in it. The storm didn't come with thunder. It came with sirens. I was in the barn feeding the chickens when I heard them 2 squad cars tearing down the gravel road like the devil was in their rear view. I dropped the feed bucket and stepped outside just in time to see a state vehicle swerve in behind them, kicking up dust and authority. I knew what it meant before the door even opened. They'd hit it. Somebody on that work crew, some subcontractor, who hadn't read the cease and desist, hadn't listened to my warnings, hadn't cared enough to question the job, had decided to push forward anyway. And this time, they dug deep. Calhoun's deputy, a young guy named Ricky, with too much buzz cut and not enough discretion, was the first to reach me. His boots crunched across the gravel face, pale voice clipped. "They hit a chamber, Mr. Hale." My chest tightened. What kind of chamber? He glanced toward the back pasture, lips pressed in a hard line. "We don't know yet. Could be ceremonial. Could be a catacomb. All I know is a skull came up with a carved obsidian fragment beside it. They stopped work immediately. Thank God, but the damage." I didn't wait for the rest. I started walking. I crossed the barnyard past the tree line and followed the carved tire path back down to the mounds. When I crested the ridge, I saw them 4 men in reflective vests standing beside a hole that hadn't been there yesterday. They looked like children caught breaking into a tomb, pale, ashen, speechless. The hole wasn't wide. Maybe 5 feet across, 2 feet deep. But what it exposed was unmistakable layered sediment disrupted by machinery, a collapsed ring of smooth stones, and in the center, bones, delicate interwoven, shaped by time and reverence. And next to it, half buried, was an artifact, shimmering black, obsidian, hand-carved, a ceremonial knife or talisman, its edge chipped by whatever backhoe or auger they'd used to get here. Dr. Shelby Cole was already on site when I arrived, crouched beside the hole in silent fury. She didn't look at me right away. She just pointed. "They broke through a burial ring," she said. "This isn't just a site anymore. This is a sacred enclosure, potentially part of a tribal ceremonial ground. That obsidian fragment," she held it up in her gloved hand. "We date these back to 1100 AD. 1100. 900 years. And some HOA contractor had cracked through it like it was just bedrock in the way of a pool installation." I stood still, barely breathing. The trees were too quiet, the air too still. Then I turned to the contractor in charge, a gruff man with dirt on his sleeves and panic behind his eyes. "Who authorized this?" I asked. He licked his lips. We were told to finish the soil tests. Langston said the injunction only applied to the north section, that the southern slope hadn't been verified." "She lied," I snapped, "and you're complicit." His mouth opened, but no words came, only the weight of what he'd done. Calhoun arrived a minute later, taking it all in with that squint he used when he smelled a cover-up. He didn't waste time. He called in additional patrol units, taped off the site, and pulled the contractor aside for questioning. Dr. Cole walked with me to the edge of the slope. "We're escalating this to the federal level," she said. "I've already called the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the U.S. Department of the Interior. They're sending a field agent tomorrow." I nodded. She paused, then looked at me differently. "I need to ask Richard, how did you know to protect this place all these years? You weren't trained for this." I looked out over the land at the fence line, the tree my father planted, the house barely visible through the haze. "My father told me it remembered us," I said, so I remembered it back. That night, the news broke wide. Not just local papers now, but regional outlets. A segment aired on the evening news. "Homeowner discovers HOA destroyed sacred site despite legal order." It showed drone footage of the burial ring, shots of the obsidian fragment under forensic light, clips of Thomas Red Elk issuing a formal statement condemning the desecration, and then a screenshot of an HOA memo leaked anonymously from inside the board. It contained an internal conversation between Darla Langston and the HOA's legal advisor, Peter Langley. Langley: "We can push south. The old man's bluffing about tribal stuff." Langston: "Good. Get the soil tested before he throws another tantrum. He'll fold once he sees a lawsuit." It was damning. By the next morning, Darla had locked her Facebook account. HOA's phone line was ringing off the hook, and residents were showing up outside the HOA building with signs: "Resign. Respect the dead. Not in our name. Respect the..." But I wasn't done. I went to the county registrar's office that afternoon with the old map. I found the one proving the HOA had never legally annexed my land. The zoning error from 2003. A clerk named Janet with reading glasses and a slow southern drawl reviewed every page with me. "This never went through full ratification," she muttered, tapping the signature block. "Your parcel was improperly added to the HOA zone. Technically, it still falls under independent classification, meaning they had no jurisdiction here at all." I left with certified proof, and I knew exactly what I would do with it. I called Brooke Chen, the reporter. "Tape rolling?" I asked. She chuckled, always. And then, standing in front of the burial site with the rising sun behind me, I held up the zoning map and said, "They tried to claim this land. They tried to dig it up. They tried to silence history. But it turns out they never had the right to touch a single inch of it. Not legally, not morally, not ever." It went viral within the hour. And the HOA, they weren't just panicking anymore. They were sinking. I found it 2 days after the field agents from the Department of the Interior cordoned off the southern slope. They'd set up a temporary tent near the mound, posted armed tribal rangers to ensure no further contamination occurred, and quietly begun their cataloging of the damaged burial ring. I watched from my back porch as white vans came and went, carrying tools, forensic scanners, even a mobile lab. It should have felt like closure, but it didn't. Not yet. There was something unfinished, something deeper. A heaviness in the pit of my gut I couldn't quite name. Then I remembered the oak. My father's oak. He'd planted it the spring my mother died. Said he wanted something to grow even as the rest of him fell apart. For years, he tended it like a second child. Even when he could barely stand, he'd limp out with a rusted watering can and whisper to it like an old friend. On the day of his funeral, I buried a keepsake box beneath its roots, a collection of his medals, a photo of Mom, and the dog tags he'd worn in Korea. But something about the way he'd looked at me, before he passed the quiet urgency in his eyes, had always made me wonder if he'd left something else behind. That afternoon, I walked out there with a spade in hand. The ground was dry, soft from years of leaf mulch and broken acorns. I dug carefully, slowly, following instinct more than memory. About a foot down, I hit something metallic. A second box. Smaller than the lockbox he'd given me years ago, this one was oil-sealed, wrapped in plastic, and double-latched with rusted hinges. I carried it to the porch and sat down, heart thudding as I cracked it open. Inside was a letter, yellowed with age, folded twice, and marked in his unmistakable handwriting. "For when they come back." I unfolded it with shaking hands. Joe Richard. If you're reading this, then the HOA has finally done what I always feared they would come, not just for the land, but for what lies beneath it. You know about the graves now. You've probably seen them. What you might not know is how close I came to losing everything before I could protect them. In 1987, I caught wind that the city was reviewing proposals to develop the ridge for a water tower. Quiet whispers, backdoor zoning meetings, all hush-hush. But I knew better. I knew the council had been bought by the same people who later helped Darla and her ilk build their empire. So I did what no one expected. I buried the records. I submitted a sealed addendum to the county rerouting development rights and locked the full archaeological findings away under a private preservation trust. And I left the deed to that trust in this box. The trust isn't in your name. It's in hers. Your mother's. I stopped breathing for a second. I had no idea. He'd never told me. I flipped through the rest of the pages, heart hammering. Attached was a notarized copy of the trust established in 1988, naming my mother as primary trustee, and in the event of her passing, transferring stewardship to me, under one condition that I provide evidence the land was under threat, which of course it now was. The trust was airtight, and unlike the HOA's forged releases and fake zoning approvals, this had been filed with the odd state, not just the county. I stood up stunned. All this time I thought I'd been acting alone, that I was improvising, surviving, barely staying one step ahead of the HOA's lawyers and lies. But my father had been here before me. He'd already prepared the defense. He'd buried it for the right moment. And now it was mine to wield. That evening I scanned every page and sent them to Lisa Moreno and Dr. Cole. Both responded within 10 minutes. Lisa's reply was short but powerful. This just became a federal case. The next morning, I arrived at the county courthouse in a borrowed suit and filed a formal injunction against the HOA. Not just for trespassing or civil damages, but for willful violation of tribal protection statutes, fraudulent zoning manipulation, and defamation. My evidence: the trust, the land deed, The leaked internal emails, the unauthorized dig, and the broken ceremonial chamber. It took less than a day for the county judge to grant the injunction. By 4 p.m., sheriff's deputies had posted cease and desist orders across the HOA office. One board member, Frank Delgado, resigned publicly in a tearful Facebook video. Another tried to delete their digital trail but was too late. Screenshots were already circulating in homeowner forums. But it was the video that changed everything. Brooke Chen, ever the journalist, had stitched together clips from the burial site, the drone footage, and my press statement. She ended it with me reading the final line of my father's letter, standing under the oak tree, voice thick with grief and pride. Some things are older than us, son. Some things deserve to be remembered. Make sure they never forget. That video hit 1.3 million views in 2 days. By the end of the week, the HOA was drowning in calls, media requests, and subpoenas. A class action lawsuit from homeowners was filed the next Monday. But in the quiet of my porch, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the cicadas began their nightly song, I didn't feel like a man who'd won a war. I felt like a son who had finally heard his father and answered. 2 weeks after filing the injunction, I stood on the front lawn of the HOA's administration building with a stack of documents under one arm and a storm behind my eyes. The building loomed like a fortress, stucco walls, arched windows, a plaque with Community First Harmony always etched in bronze just beside the door. The irony twisted my gut. This time I didn't come alone. Behind me stood Lisa Moreno, representing the State Heritage Commission, and on her other side was Janet from the county registrar's office, her arms crossed, tight lips pressed into a disapproving line. Even Sheriff Calhoun had shown up, standing beside his cruiser with one hand on his belt and the other gripping a copy of the court order I'd secured the previous week. And then there was Brooke Chen, press badge swinging in the wind, her cameraman capturing every second for what would become the HOA story that detonated across the internet like a thunderclap. I took a breath and stepped forward. Darla Langston stood waiting behind the tinted glass door, flanked by her legal pit bull, Peter Langley. She opened the door slowly, as if expecting a riot, or at least a crowd of angry, pitchfork-wielding homeowners. What she got instead was a parade of law and record, justice and memory. "This is private property," Peter said immediately, his voice flat, sharp. "No," Janet cut in, her voice calm but loaded. "This is community property, governed under false authority, using fraudulent zoning adjustments, filed in violation of county charter procedure." She handed him a manila envelope. "Effective immediately, the HOA's jurisdiction over the Hale property is dissolved. The board's authority in that region has no legal basis and never did." Peter blinked. Darla turned pale. Lisa stepped up next. "Furthermore," she said, "your continued denial of the indigenous site's registration has resulted in a federal review. As of today, any interference with the burial ground or surrounding acreage will be treated as a criminal act under federal preservation law." And I added, stepping forward, "You are now being served notice of a class action civil suit for defamation, trespassing, and malicious interference in private ownership." I reached into my folder and handed Darla a copy of the sealed trust, my mother's name printed bold and clean across the top. "Filed in 1988, I said. "Authenticated. Protected under 3 layers of legislation. You broke more than fences, Darla. You broke faith." Peter stepped forward, flustered, flipping through the document with trembling fingers. This doesn't override community charter. It's sentimental, but..." Lisa cut him off. "It's not sentimental. It's enforceable. And it's already in front of a federal magistrate." The door behind them opened again, and one of the junior board members, Frank Delgado, the one who'd resigned, stepped out looking 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him. "I tried to warn them," he mumbled. "About the documents, about the land. No one listened." He walked past us without another word. Inside, Brooke and her cameraman followed us as we entered the HOA boardroom, a long table, fake mahogany lined with chairs that now looked like empty thrones stripped of power. Darla sat at the head, shaking visibly as I laid down my final card. The original zoning map. The one my grandfather had fought to keep. The one the county had confirmed was never properly amended. The one that in clear, bold lines showed my land sitting outside HOA bounds. "You've bullied us for decades," I said. "Called it beautification. Called it improvement. Called it community." I looked up at her, really looked. Not with hate, but with finality. "You called it governance, but it was greed. And now the whole county sees it for what it is. The silence that followed was thick. Lisa handed over her final form, a preservation order expanding the site's protection perimeter by an additional 5 acres with government oversight. Any attempt to reverse this ruling, she said flatly, will be met with prosecution. Darla's eyes welled for the first time, not with rage, with shame. It wasn't until we stepped back outside, reporters waiting, neighbors staring, that the reality sank in. The empire had fallen, not with violence, not with vengeance, but with proof, with records, with patience and memory, and a father's buried foresight. As I spoke to the press, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I just told the truth. This land remembers who kept it safe, and it just helped me remember who I am. When I finished, the crowd didn't cheer. They nodded. Quiet, respectful, as if they finally saw what had been buried under the surface of this neighborhood for decades. Not just bones, but arrogance. Not just history, but resistance. Darla stepped down 3 days later. Peter Langley was disbarred within 6 months for ethical violations. The HOA board was dissolved in a homeowner vote. A new leaner committee formed, transparent, limited in power, and bound by the real laws of the land. As for me, I never once raised my voice. But somehow I made the whole damn neighborhood listen. I thought the worst was over after the injunction, the federal preservation order, and Darla's resignation. I thought the soil had swallowed their arrogance, the law had broken their grip, and the community had finally begun to heal. But then came the audit. The district attorney's office, already knee-deep in records from my lawsuit, expanded their investigation. What started as a probe into unauthorized excavation turned into a full-scale forensic sweep of the HOA's financials, property disputes, and internal communications. That's when the rot started to surface. Turns out my land wasn't the only place they'd set their sights on. A retired couple down the street, the Nguyens, had been pressured into selling part of their backyard to make way for a utility easement that never got built. Another neighbor, a single mom named Kelsey, had been fined over $3,000 for non-standard fencing offense that had stood unchallenged for over 15 years. And then there was the missing money. Tens of thousands siphoned into consultation fees and improvement projects that had no paper trail. It all pointed to one thing: a HOA board not just drunk on power, but addicted to using that power for personal gain. On the third Friday of the investigation, the county summoned the entire board, current and former members, to a public hearing at the Civic Center. The room was packed, not just with reporters and residents, but with tribal elders, historians, and former homeowners who had been run out by the same people, now seated at the front of the room in stiff metal chairs under fluorescent lights. I sat in the front row, folder in hand, the same one my father once held when he fought this battle in quieter ways. When they called my name to testify, I stood slowly. I didn't wear a suit this time, just boots, denim, and the old jacket my father wore when he planted the oak tree behind the house. I walked to the microphone and looked the board members in the eyes one by one. Darla was there, even though she had resigned. She couldn't avoid the subpoena. Her eyes were rimmed red. Her hands clutched a tissue like it was the last thing tethering her to this earth. I didn't feel satisfaction, just gravity. I began by reading the original preservation deed, line by line. Then I presented the 1988 trust document, explaining how it had been designed not for profit, but for protection. How my father decades ago had seen the signs and built the safeguards. I showed the zoning map that proved my land was never theirs. I laid out the forgeries, the unratified annexation attempt, the internal emails about bluffing and folding. Then I paused, and I pulled out a final letter, one that had never been opened before. It was addressed to me from my father, but dated just 1 day before his death. I read it aloud. If you're holding this, then you fought the way I hoped you never had to. I didn't want you to live with your fists up, but I'm proud you never dropped them when it counted. If they cry, let them. If they don't, let the truth do the weeping for them. You didn't inherit this land. You inherited the responsibility to remember it. That's harder. But it's nobler. By the time I looked up, the room was silent. Not just quiet, silent. No shuffling. No whispers. Just the stillness of something sacred passing through walls built on arrogance. One board member, an older woman named Cheryl, was already crying. Her shoulders shook. Another, the treasurer, collapsed into his hands, shaking his head like the weight of it all had finally crushed his spine. A third tried to speak, then broke mid-sentence, the words lost in the sound of his own shame. Darla didn't cry. Not at first. She stared at the letter, like it was a flame inching closer to her brittle defenses. Then slowly her hand dropped the tissue and she whispered, "We thought we were just managing a neighborhood. We didn't know we were erasing it." The tribal elder seated beside me stood and spoke. "Intent does not erase damage," he said, "but truth can begin repair." That was when Darla broke. Not with a scream, not with denial, but with a quiet gasp, followed by tears genuine this time. The kind that don't ask for forgiveness, just release. I don't know if she wept for what she did, or for how long she'd been blind to what it meant, but she wept. All of them did, in one way or another. It wasn't vengeance that brought them to tears. It was clarity. The board was formally dissolved by majority vote 3 days later. Criminal charges were filed against Peter Langley, along with 2 former members tied to the misappropriation of funds and falsified filings. They're still being processed through the courts. The Tribal Council and the State Heritage Commission jointly established a permanent memorial site on the land with my family's blessing. It will remain closed to development, protected not just by law, but by story. At the ceremony, Tomas Red Elk approached me with something wrapped in red cloth. When I unwrapped it, I found a polished stone obsidian smooth as river glass, carved with a single line in Caddo script. He told me it meant remembers. Not memory. Remembers. Because it's not just the past that defines us. It's what we choose to protect. The wind shifted that morning cooler, calmer. It swept down from the hills with a softness I hadn't felt in months. As I stepped onto the back porch with a mug of coffee in one hand and the obsidian stone in the other, I could feel the land settling again. Like a heartbeat that had finally slowed after running too long. It had been nearly 4 months since the last bulldozer left the ridge. 3 since the memorial stones were placed. 2 since the final board member signed the dissolution order that ended the HOA's reign. And just 1 week since the county officially reclassified my property back to its original designation, independent, unincorporated, and untouchable. No more fines, no more letters, no more HOA. It was over. But it wasn't just a legal victory. It was spiritual. That morning, I walked the fence line. Not as a soldier guarding something under siege, but as a steward returning to a land that remembered him. The soil looked different now. Not because it had changed, but because I had. I no longer saw it as a battleground. I saw it as legacy. The oak tree stood tall near the southern rise. Beneath its wide shade sat a new bench, one carved from the very cedar planks my father had stored in the old barn. Rafters planks we'd milled together the summer I came home from the Navy, when we still believed we had all the time in the world. I sat there now, letting the wood hold me. The memorial site beyond the hill had been designed with the tribe's input. No plaque, no monument, just a simple ring of stones and native grasses allowed to grow wild. A sacred space not for tourism or traffic, but for remembrance. Dr. Shelby Cole had said it best during the dedication. The greatest protection we can offer the past is to let it rest undisturbed. A local artist had painted a mural on the old HOA building before it was turned into a community-run co-op. It showed an elderly hand reaching into the earth, pulling forth, not treasure, but truth. Bones, roots, stone, and memory entwined like veins through history. Brooks' article accompanying the photo called it "The Land That Said No." But perhaps what struck me most was the quiet. The same neighbors who once avoided eye contact now waved as they passed. Some stopped to talk. Others brought over pies, bread, or simple thank you notes left in the mailbox. The ones who had once feared speaking out found their voices. Kelsey, the single mom fined for her fence, was now head of the new Neighborhood Advisory Board, a volunteer group without enforcement powers, but with real transparency. The Nguyen's. They got their land back, and the city quietly retracted the utility easement that had never been real to begin with. Justice didn't come with a bang. It came with more clarity, with healing, with the slow rebuilding of trust. The tribe invited me to attend a seasonal gathering. I went unsure of whether I'd be welcomed, but Tomas Red Elk greeted me with a solemn nod, and a second stone, this one smaller, smoother, carved with a different word. Guard. You didn't just protect the land, he told me. You guarded the memory. That's harder. I keep both stones on the mantle now. Remembers and guard, one from the past, one for the future. That evening, I stood in the doorway of the barn watching the sun slip behind the far hills. The same golden wash my father used to pause and stare at every night before bed. I whispered a few words into the wind, not prayers, just thanks. Thanks that I'd been given the strength to stand, the voice to speak, and the wisdom not to walk away. And I thought of my father, what he'd buried, what he'd protected, what he passed to me, not as inheritance, but as a charge. He didn't teach me how to win a war. He taught me how to remember one. The phone rang just as I stepped back inside. It was Lisa. We got the final ruling, she said. Federal recognition of the site. Permanent protection status. And your deed's been updated to reflect custodial designation. They can't touch it again, Rich. Not ever. I didn't say anything at first. Just let it sink in. Finally, I exhaled. Good, I said. It's time it rests in peace. And maybe now I could too. I walked out one last time that night, barefoot in the soil, the way my father used to do. I stood beneath the oak tree as the stars came out slow and scattered. I closed my eyes and let the wind run its fingers through the branches. The land was quiet. The fight was over. And in the stillness, I knew one final truth. They had come to take what they thought was just earth. But what they touched was memory. And memory never forgets who tried to steal it.